Hello everyone, welcome to this new lecture in our program on American literature. My name is Fuzi Slisli. Today's lecture is about the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a very important cultural event that happens at the turn of the 20th century. It has roots in the past and it has branches that extend to the present. Let us explain. The Harlem Renaissance is a flowering of African American art, literature, music, and culture in the United States, led primarily by the African American community based in the neighborhood Harlem in New York City. So it's a boisterous and lavish flowering of African American art, culture, literature, and music that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century in one specific neighborhood in New York City called Harlem. And the movement was led primarily by African American artists, writers, musicians, and cultural icons. Harlem, in a way, it's still there as a neighborhood today. If you visit New York City, make sure to stop and visit Harlem. But Harlem was not so much a place as a state of mind. It's the cultural metaphor of Black America. Harlem, in a way, in the 20th century was the identity and the cultural metaphor of Black America. When did it happen? Well, it began with the emergence of writings and journals, like, for example, the journal Opportunity. It's a journal of African American life and culture. It began in 1924. It's a magazine hosted a party for black writers with many white publishers attending. And it ended in 1929, the year of the stock market crash and the resulting economic Great Depression. So basically, this magazine, Opportunity, hosted a party. They brought black writers, novelists, playwrights, poets, and they brought white publishers, white Americans who owned publication houses, and introduced them together so that they can do work together. This is 1924. It came to an end in 1929. It came to an end officially, but culturally, intellectually, the Harlem Renaissance, in a way, lives until today. But officially, it ended in 1929 when the stock market crashed in New York City, in the United States, and the whole world felt it, and brought the era of the Great Depression, which is known as the Great Depression. The Harlem Renaissance, known also as the New Negro Movement and the Negro Renaissance, was an important cultural manifestation of the mid-20s and 30s. With Harlem at its center, the neighborhood Harlem in Manhattan, the Renaissance was an upsurge of a new racial attitude and ideals on the part of African Americans and an artistic and political awakening. It was partly inspired by the iconoclastic spirit of the times. The Harlem writers and artists were like their modernist white counterparts in quest of new forms, images, and techniques. In a way, we studied Faulkner and we saw some instances of modernist writing there. There is a time is relative and cyclical, and the ideas of death and watching and subjectivity and identity is all messed up. Well, Harlem writers, just like their white modernist counterparts, were also looking for new forms of expression, new images and new techniques to express themselves in art, in culture, in literature. They too were skeptical and disillusioned. Just like William Faulkner, a writer from the South, was disillusioned and skeptical of the decaying and dead culture of the South that remained just like a corpse, a dead corpse, right? And Harlem Renaissance writers were also skeptical and disillusioned. What chiefly differentiated them, however, from their white modernist writers was their view of artistic endeavor as an extension of the struggle against oppression. This is what set Harlem Renaissance writers apart from modernist, white modernist writers. For Harlem Renaissance writers, art and literature and culture was part of the struggle against oppression, part of the struggle for racial equality, for human rights and civil rights. And of course, Harlem Renaissance has historical roots. The historical roots are complex. In part, they lay in the vast migration of African Americans from the South to northern industrial centers that began early in the 20th century and increased rapidly as World War I production needs and labor shortages boosted job opportunities. So these factories needed workers, and black people moved from the South to northern industrial cities. In addition to industrial jobs in northern cities, World War I offered blacks the opportunity to serve in the military, although in segregated military units. They weren't part of, with the American military. They were in separate military units. So who were they? Who were the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance? Many of these people were part of the Great Migration, what is called the Great Migration out of the South, and other racially stratified communities. And this Great Migration happened between 1920 and 1930. And here, almost 750,000 African Americans left the South, the American South, and many of them migrated to urban areas in the North to take advantage of the prosperity and the more racially tolerant environment. There was less racism and more economic opportunity in the North, in northern cities. So almost about 1 million of African Americans migrated from the American South to northern cities. The Harlem section of Manhattan in New York City drew nearly 175,000 African Americans, turning the neighborhood, Harlem, into the largest concentration of black people in the United States. There is a map here, which you can see in the documents we are providing, that shows the movement of migration from the South into industrial cities in the North, including New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Rochester, Buffalo, Cleveland, Chicago, and all the way to Minneapolis, St. Louis, and of course Detroit later on, but also to cities in the West like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. So between 1910 and 1930, African American population in the North rose by about 20%. Cities such as Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Cleveland had some of the biggest increases. What were the factors behind the Great Migration? Well, first of all, it was to avoid the racial segregation of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws that separated whites from blacks in the South. The North didn't have segregation laws, but the South did have segregation laws. So black people couldn't use the same restaurants as white people, they couldn't send their children to the same schools, they couldn't take the same jobs, and so on and so forth. Boll weevil infestation in southern cotton in the late 1910s forced people to search for other work. Blacks could take the service jobs that new white factory workers had vacated. They were service jobs in factories. The Immigration Act of 1924 stopped European immigrants, and that caused a shortage of factory workers, which black people came and filled. And then the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which displaced thousands of African American farm workers. These displaced farm workers will find their way to the north, to places like Harlem. The immediate effects of the Harlem Renaissance was music, literature, and art. They flourished. So in music, for example, there is the appearance of jazz. Jazz is the first urban musical form of the African American community in the United States. It's a city music genre that appeared in New York City, in Harlem. And it used instruments like brass instruments, woodwind instruments, with trumpets, trombones, and saxophones playing lead parts in this music. Jazz is also characterized by intricate leads and accidentals, complex chords, syncopated rhythms, and improvised solos. This is what came to be called the big band, right? The big band music. So you have these like big bands or swing. They couldn't use microphones, so they meant that musicians increased the size of the band to increase the sound because they couldn't use microphones. They used composers and arrangers, and there was little room for improvisation. This is the swing. This was what was there before jazz. Notable musicians of the big band included Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong with the saxophone, of course, the trumpet and saxophone, and then Bessie Smith, the lady Bessie Smith, and Cab Calloway, to name only a few. The club, Cotton Club in New York City in Harlem, became world famous. There is an amazing film about it by Francis Ford Coppola. It's a club that became famous worldwide for its music and its dancing and its culture, but it's a club that black people could not come and attend and watch. They were the entertainment, but they could not sit and be among the audience. Let's talk about the influences on literature. Against the background of increasingly artistic activity, 3 events occurred between 1924 and 1926 that launched the already developing literary phase of the Harlem Renaissance into the forefront. First, Charles S. Johnson's Civic Club dinner. This is a dinner that Charles Johnson was organizing. He called it Civic Club dinner, which forged the link among 3 major players in the literary Renaissance. The black literary political intelligentsia, this is the intellectuals, the black writers, thinkers, political activists, and the white publishers and critics and the young black writers. So Mr. Charles Johnson organized these civic dinners where he brought these three sections of the community: black literary and political intelligentsia, white publishers and critics, and young black writers. The publication in 1926 of Nigger Heaven by white novelist Carl van Vechten, this book was a spectacularly popular expose of Harlem life and helped create the Negro Vogue, a Negro fashion, a fashion of black people that drew thousands of sophisticated New Yorkers to Harlem's exotic nightlife. Even for white people across the country and mostly across New York, they fell in love with the Negro Vogue of the 1920s. The publication of the literary magazine Fire, this is a literary magazine, a group of talented young black writers were spearheaded by Wallace Thurman. These artists were declaring their intent to assume ownership of the literary Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance incorporated all aspects of African American culture in its literature, and several themes emerged. The common themes of the Harlem Renaissance included the question of marginality. Black people felt marginalized and wanted to express that situation. They also wanted to express their folk tradition, because by that time African Americans had been in North America for 400 or 500 years, and they developed their own folk tradition, which also they wanted to showcase and introduce to the wider American public. The blues tradition also emerged and became widespread and more widely known in America and across the world. Of course, it will take the world by storm. And the question of alienation, the feeling of not belonging, which dogged the African American community, and the Harlem Renaissance allowed them to express themselves about it. Also, and finally, the problem of writing for an elite audience, right? Because it's a problem when you have a culture that succeeds only in addressing the elite in the community. So the question of how can we address average people, how can we make this literature and culture appealing to average people, was also discussed and addressed. So you have marginality, folk material, the blues, alienation, and the problem of writing for an elite culture. Through all these themes, the Harlem Renaissance writers were determined to express the African American experience in all its variety and complexity as realistically as possible, right? They wanted to express an authentic African American experience. Some of the famous writers included Langston Hughes, of course, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston. Notable artists included William Johnson, and we're including here a copy of his self-portrait with a bandana, The Ascent of Ethiopia by Louis Milo Jones, Dust to Dust by Jacob Lawrence. These were all paintings that became super famous and received a lot of attention. Blues by Archibald Motley Jr. And finally, let's ask the question, why did the Harlem Renaissance end? Well, first of all, the Great Economic Depression of 1929 had a huge impact on cultural activity across the United States. So there wasn't just an impact on the Harlem Renaissance, but on culture and literature and art across the United States. The migration tones down after 1929, and communities finally settled. Fundamentalists cursed the devil's music and art, so there was a lot of religious fundamentalists in the United States that condemned jazz music, and they called it the devil's music and devil's art and so on and so forth. And also, to answer the question, why did the Harlem Renaissance end? Well, it didn't end. It evolved and changed, and it evolved from jazz and blues, for example, in music, into rock and roll, Motown, hip-hop, and today, rap music. It also evolved from jazz and blues into the white community, white American community, and these art forms were taken by white entrepreneurs and commercialized. So there appeared people like Elvis Presley, Gershwin, Frank Sinatra, and so on. All of them have taken an art form that began in the Harlem Renaissance by African American musicians and artists. The legacy of the Harlem Renaissance, first of all, there is a paradox that art, its legacy is the paradox that art as a release of and contributor to tension. It releases tension, but also contributes to tension. This is art. The legacy of the Harlem Renaissance is the creation of a white audience for African American culture, art, literature, and music. Also, the glorification and sophistication of African American life and culture. It became cool to be black. It became beautiful to be black, to the point that even white people start imitating black lifestyles and black fashions. There is also a perplexing sense of optimism in the Harlem Renaissance art. Also, a result of the Harlem Renaissance is black pride. There is the notion of black pride. I'm black and I'm proud, as James Brown says in his famous song. I'm black, say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. So black pride, and of course the civil rights movement that will develop, that will emerge in the 1960s. And, you know, I mean, it emerged before, but it finally took a national form in the 1960s and led to the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And then the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance is that it became an international phenomenon, a worldwide phenomenon. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope it makes you curious about reading and learning more about the roots of the Harlem Renaissance and the development of the Harlem Renaissance and the amazing writers and musicians of the Harlem Renaissance. Until the next lecture, I hope you are well, and I'll see you soon. Take care.